a world-renowned icon gunned down in broad daylight. A killer on the loose with no clear motive, leaving a trail of confusion and fear. Gianni Versace's murder shocked the world. But what if the truth was even darker than we imagined? Dive into the twisted obsession, betrayal, and lies that led to the killing of a fashion legend. The story you think you know is only the beginning. Hello and welcome to Crime Headquarters. Many of you love diving into these stories as you unwind for the night, and I'm here to guide you through another gripping tale. So, find a quiet spot, get comfortable, and let the world fade away as we begin. Tonight's story is one of tangled emotions, quiet betrayals, and a tragedy that could have been avoided, but wasn't. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share, helping others discover these stories too. Now, let go. Let the details unfold slowly, and drift into the night as the story unfolds. Part 1. The Killing of Gianni Versace. On July 15, 1997, a loud bang echoed across the steps of a mansion in the heart of Miami. Gianni Versace, the man who built an empire with his designs, a fashion icon whose name was synonymous with luxury and elegance, fell to the ground. The shooter, dressed in black, disappeared into the streets, leaving the city in chaos. And guess what? He was shot right outside his own home. Yes, his home. The news spread faster than anyone could process. How could someone so loved, so admired, be taken so suddenly? What really happened? Let's go right into the events surrounding that. Miami, in the summer of '97, was a city on the edge. The air was thick with heat, the skyline painted with neon lights, a place where the rich and famous lived out their fantasies. The beaches were a blur of beauty, and the streets were lined with cars that cost more than most people's homes. Miami wasn't just a city, it was a playground for the elite, and Gianni Versace was at the top of that world. The world of high fashion had been forever altered by him. His creations, bold and beautiful, changed how people thought about design. Versace's empire wasn't just about clothes. It was about shaping culture itself. Celebrities walked his runway, wore his designs, and were often seen at his side, as if to say, "This is where the elite come to be seen." But on that fateful morning, as the sun bathed the streets in gold, no one could have imagined how swiftly it would all come crashing down. Gianni Versace, the man whose art had captivated the world, would soon be reduced to a headline, a tragic story that no one saw coming. And the person who did it, he wasn't a stranger. Gianni Versace had met him before, Andrew Cunanan. To most, the name meant little, but for one man, it was the culmination of years of obsession. Cunanan wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had been following Versace for years, building a twisted attachment to the designer. It was a connection that no one knew about, one that would spiral into an act of violence that stunned the world. Cunanan, whose name would soon be linked to a series of murders across the country, had somehow wormed his way into Versace's life. But no one, as in no one, knew how deep the obsession ran or how far it would take him. Until that moment, until that shot rang out. A shot that would forever change the landscape of both fashion and crime. Now, let's unravel the events that led to that fateful day, when the streets of Miami became the backdrop to one of the most shocking crimes in modern history. Keep watching. Gianni Versace was born in 1946 in Reggio Calabria, Italy, a place far removed from the bright lights of Milan or Paris. His early life was shaped by his mother, who was a dressmaker, and from a young age, Gianni was immersed in the world of fashion. It was in his mother's workshop, watching her sew, that the young Gianni first found his passion for design. What started as a fascination with fabrics and stitching quickly grew into an obsession with beauty, precision, and style. Versace wasn't just interested in fashion. He wanted to revolutionize it. In the early 1970s, he moved to Milan, where he began working for Italian fashion houses. But it was only a matter of time before he realized he needed to forge his own path. In 1978, Versace launched his own brand, and by the mid-1980s, it was clear that he was no ordinary designer. His bold, daring designs began to push boundaries, blending high fashion with elements of pop culture, art, and architecture. The Versace brand wasn't just about clothes. It was about an attitude, a way of living. He dressed some of the world's biggest stars, like Madonna, Elton John, Princess Diana, and made the runway a spectacle, a place of sheer drama and flair. His creations were worn by the rich and powerful, and Versace himself became a household name. But what set him apart from other designers was his ability to transcend fashion and enter the realm of celebrity. The fashion world, often exclusive and elusive, welcomed him with open arms. He was no longer just a designer, he was a cultural icon. His name, Versace, became synonymous with luxury, excess, and glamour. He wasn't just creating clothing, he was crafting an identity. His pieces were more than fabric and thread. They were symbols of power, success, and fame. Gianni Versace's empire wasn't just based in Milan. He took the world by storm, from his flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York City to his mansion in Miami. Where his death would later take place, Versace's reach was global. His style was eclectic, his designs were bold, and his presence in the world of fashion was undeniable. He had an unmistakable signature, opulent, seductive, and undeniably powerful. His work made people feel like they could conquer the world, just like him. So, when his death happened, it wasn't just the loss of a designer. It was the loss of an entire vision, an entire era of fashion. It was a blow to the industry that left a void no one could fill. Who was the killer? Let's find out a bit about his background. Andrew Cunanan, born in 1967, wasn't born into the world of luxury. He came from a much darker background. Raised in a strict Filipino-American family, Cunanan's early years were marked by instability and a yearning for attention. His father, a strict and often abusive man, was emotionally distant, leaving Andrew with a deep need for validation. But his mother, a woman desperate to maintain appearances, would go to any length to keep up the facade of a perfect family. This created an environment where Andrew learned to mask his true emotions, to present himself as someone he was not. From a young age, Cunanan learned to charm. He became adept at playing different roles. One moment, he is sweet and innocent. The next moment, he's calculating and manipulative. He was a master of deception, easily convincing people of his worth, even when deep down, he was nothing like the person he pretended to be. In high school, he was a social chameleon, easily slipping between groups, always the life of the party, but never truly close to anyone. He wore the mask of confidence, but underneath, there was a deep insecurity that only grew with time. As he grew older, Cunanan became more ambitious, more desperate for attention, and more willing to do anything to gain the acceptance he so craved. His charm was his weapon, as he seduced wealthy men, got into high society circles, and played the role of the young, handsome socialite. But behind the polished exterior, something was terribly wrong. His obsession with status, with wealth, and with admiration began to consume him. He wasn't just chasing money or luxury, he was chasing validation, the sense that he was someone important, someone worthy. And while he was living this double life, he began to feel the strain of his deceit. The relationships he formed, though often fleeting, were based on manipulation, not love. By the time he moved to San Diego in the early 1990s, Cunanan had already been linked to several violent incidents. His charm had started to fade, and his darker tendencies were beginning to surface. People began to see him for what he truly was, a man with an unquenchable thirst for power and control, willing to destroy anyone who got in his way. Cunanan's life was a series of lies, and his ability to weave those lies into the fabric of his relationships gave him a strange sense of power. But his internal world was crumbling. His desperation was growing, and his need for recognition, for being seen as someone extraordinary, was escalating into something dangerous. The question now is, how did Andrew Cunanan, a man driven by obsession, come into contact with Gianni Versace, a global superstar whose name represents wealth and glamour? Well, we're about to see that. The connection between the two wasn't deep. In fact, it was fleeting. The two men met briefly in the early 90s, a chance encounter that left a lasting impact on Cunanan. Versace, ever the gracious host, had met Cunanan at a party. It was nothing extraordinary, just a brief moment, a handshake, a conversation that didn't mean much to Johnny. But to Cunanan, that moment became everything. In the world of high society, people meet and mingle all the time. But for Cunanan, that fleeting interaction was a spark that set fire to his obsession. To him, Versace wasn't just a designer. He was the embodiment of everything Cunanan had ever wanted. The power, beauty, influence, and status. The fact that Versace had treated him with kindness, even for a moment, was enough to fuel his growing obsession. He became fixated, seeing Versace not just as a celebrity but as a symbol of the life he so desperately craved. Over time, this obsession would only intensify. Cunanan, who had long struggled with feelings of inadequacy, began to see Versace as the ultimate trophy. He wasn't just drawn to the designer's wealth or fame. He wanted to be part of that world, to break into that realm. Cunanan, who had always been on the outside looking in, saw the brief moment with Versace as an invitation, a sign that he too could be part of the inner circle, that he too could be someone important. But Gianni Versace wasn't interested. He had no reason to be, and no reason to remember Cunanan. But for Andrew, the rejection was more than just a brush off, it was the ultimate insult. It fed the growing rage inside him. His obsession with Versace evolved from admiration to something darker, something more dangerous. As the years passed, Cunanan's anger grew. It was no longer about the brief meeting. It was about the denial of his place in that world, the world of the rich and famous, the world that Gianni Versace had ruled. Cunanan's feelings of rejection became a violent obsession. He couldn't accept the fact that the doors to this world would never open for him, and in his twisted mind, the only way to claim his place was to destroy the person who embodied everything he longed for. This wasn't just about revenge. It wasn't just about a man who couldn't handle rejection. For Cunanan, it became a mission. The man who had lived his life fabricating stories and identities now found himself on a new path, one that would end in murder. And Gianni Versace, the very man who represented everything Cunanan could never have, would become his ultimate target. The obsession had grown so powerful that it would lead to one fateful moment, one that no one saw coming. That was when Andrew Cunanan got killed. And for the killer, his first known murder had taken place months before in April 1997, when he brutally murdered his friend, Jeffrey Trail, in Minneapolis. But that was only the beginning. What followed was a string of violent killings as Cunanan moved from state to state, leaving bodies behind him. His rampage had taken him to Chicago, where he killed a second man, David Madsen, a lover he had once shared a brief relationship with. He didn't stop there. The killings continued, one after another, in a violent quest to feed his obsession with power and control. Each murder seemed to be more random, more senseless, yet each one was methodical in its brutality. Cunanan was no longer just a man on the run. He had become a figure of fear, his name whispered with a mix of dread and disbelief. As the authorities pieced together the clues, they realized they were chasing someone who wasn't just a killer. He was a man with nothing to lose. With every passing day, the manhunt for Cunanan grew more intense. Police departments across the country were on high alert, their efforts to capture him failing to bring any leads. And then, in late June, the name Gianni Versace appeared in the investigation. The once celebrated designer, whose life was the embodiment of the glamorous world of fashion, was now an unexpected link to a maniacal killer. There were rumors, whispers in the media, that Cunanan had some sort of connection to Versace, that the designer had been involved in a fleeting interaction with Cunanan years before. At first, the authorities dismissed it, too improbable to be true, but Cunanan's obsession was something they had underestimated. As the search for Cunanan reached a fever pitch, no one could have predicted that it would end in the most shocking way possible. Gianni Versace, the man who had built a fashion empire, would become the final victim in Cunanan's killing spree. But again, how exactly did the murder happen? Let's go back in time. On the morning of July 15, 1997, Miami was a city that was already in full swing. The sun had just risen, casting a golden glow over the streets. The city's energy was electric, the atmosphere thick with the heat and humidity of a typical summer day. But for Gianni Versace, the morning was routine. His Miami mansion, Casa Casuarina, stood at the heart of the city's most exclusive district, Ocean Drive. The mansion was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape from the public eye when he wasn't strutting down the catwalks of Milan or New York. Versace's routine on that fateful day started like any other. He had breakfast in the mansion with his partner, Antonio D'Amico. They spent a quiet morning together before Versace decided to step out for a few errands. He was planning to visit a local cafe, a routine he enjoyed while taking in the early morning sights of the city. But that day, something was different. The tension was in the air. The undercurrent of fear that had followed Cunanan across the country was now closing in on Miami. Versace, a man used to being watched, unaware that the eyes of a killer were upon him that very morning. As Versace walked down the steps of his mansion, a man dressed in black, his features partially concealed, appeared in the distance. Andrew Cunanan had been in Miami for several days, lying low and staying under the radar, but the obsession that had built up over years was about to culminate in a brutal act of violence. Cunanan, armed with a .40 caliber pistol, made his move. He had been stalking the mansion, waiting for the right moment. He was determined, fixated on the idea that by killing Versace, he would somehow take control of the world that had rejected him. His rage had been building, and now, as he approached the mansion, it was all coming to a head. With cold precision, Cunanan raised the gun and fired. The first shot rang out, hitting Versace in the back of the head. Versace collapsed, crumpling to the ground, as Cunanan took a moment to step back, ensuring his victim was down. But the violence didn't end there. Cunanan fired 2 more shots, hitting Versace once more, in the neck and the cheek. The designer's body lay on the steps, lifeless, as the Miami morning went still. Cunanan didn't hesitate. With the murder carried out, he calmly walked away from the scene, disappearing into the streets of Miami. The entire event took mere moments, but the shock waves it sent would reverberate for years. Gianni Versace, the man who had revolutionized fashion, was dead, and the world would never be the same. The immediate aftermath of the murder was chaos. A stunned silence fell over the city, followed by panic and disbelief. The news spread quickly, first across Miami, then throughout the world. The image of Gianni Versace, a man who had been so vibrant, so alive just moments before, now lifeless on his own doorstep, left people in shock. Police swarmed the area, securing the crime scene as they tried to piece together what had happened. By the time the media arrived, the story was already breaking. Gianni Versace had been murdered, and the man responsible was on the run. But it wasn't just the fashion world that was rocked. The murder was global news. Versace wasn't just a designer. He was a cultural figure, and his death was more than just the end of a man's life. It was the end of an era in fashion. The world watched as the manhunt for Cunanan intensified, but no one could have predicted the eerie turn the case would take. In the days that followed, the media went into overdrive, speculating on why Cunanan had targeted Versace, but the details of their connection were still murky. Cunanan's motives weren't clear, but the media painted a picture of obsession, rage, and jealousy. The police and the public were left to wonder what had driven Cunanan to kill the man who had been the face of luxury, the man who had created a world most people could only dream of entering. The murder didn't just affect the fashion world, it touched everyone. For those who admired Versace's designs, his boldness, and his unapologetic luxury, his death was a loss of something far greater than just a designer. It was the loss of an icon. The news coverage went global, with countless stories, interviews, and opinions flooding the airwaves. People across the world mourned the loss of Gianni Versace, and at the same time, they became more and more intrigued by the killer. The media frenzy that followed only added to the mystique of Andrew Cunanan, who remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks, evading capture. What began as a murder that shocked the world quickly spiraled into a nationwide obsession, a story that would remain unsolved for days. Versace's name was on the lips of everyone, and the mystery surrounding his death only added to the tragic aura that would surround his legacy. As authorities searched high and low for Cunanan, the world was left with one haunting question. Why him? Why Versace? Why had this man, a notorious killer, chosen the designer as his final victim? No one could answer that. After Gianni Versace's murder, the hunt for Andrew Cunanan quickly turned into a nationwide spectacle. As soon as the police identified him as the prime suspect, they launched a full-scale manhunt that would stretch across the United States. Cunanan, however, had already perfected the art of evasion. In the days following the murder, he became a ghost, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement's efforts to catch him. The manhunt intensified. The FBI, along with local police forces across the country, set up checkpoints, distributed his wanted posters, and made urgent appeals to the public. The pressure mounted on Cunanan, but he remained elusive. He had no fixed address, no real pattern of movement. He traveled from city to city, relying on a network of old friends, acquaintances, and perhaps strangers who unwittingly helped him hide. The world was captivated, watching as law enforcement scrambled to find him, while Cunanan played his game of cat and mouse. Every day, the authorities seemed closer, but Cunanan always managed to stay one step ahead. His ability to blend into his surroundings, to disappear when needed, became his most terrifying skill. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about making the authorities believe they were closing in on him, only to have him vanish again. His life was one long escape, and he had mastered it. As the days turned into a week, the urgency of his capture grew. The public wanted more answers. Why had Cunanan murdered Versace? What had been his motive? But answers were hard to come by. Cunanan's previous murders had been chaotic, seemingly random acts of violence, and no clear link to Versace had been established until after the crime. Speculation swirled. Was it truly an obsession with the designer, or was it something deeper, a need to be seen, to matter in a world that had rejected him? Law enforcement had their theories, but without Cunanan to explain his actions, the questions remained unanswered. Then, just 8 days after he killed Versace, Cunanan was found. The discovery was as shocking as it was anticlimactic. On July 23, 1997, Cunanan's body was found in a houseboat in Miami Beach, Florida. He had taken his own life. A single bullet to the head, fired from the same gun he had used to kill Gianni Versace. The authorities were left with the bitter irony of having spent days chasing a killer who had already ended his own life. Cunanan's death only deepened the mystery. Was he truly insane? What drove him to murder Versace of all people? Without a clear motive, the questions about Cunanan's psyche and his obsession with the designer would forever remain unanswered. The lack of closure left a haunting feeling, as if the puzzle pieces of his life, his hatred, his obsession, and his murderous spree, would never truly fit together. As for Versace, his legacy was solidified in a way no one could have predicted. In death, he became even more iconic, a symbol of both the height of success and the tragic end of an era. His name lived on in his fashion house, which was taken over by his sister, Donatella Versace, and continued to thrive. His impact on the fashion world remained undeniable. His bold designs, his fearless approach to blending art and fashion, left a lasting imprint on the industry. He was, and still is, remembered as one of the most influential designers of the 20th century. But his murder left a scar on the fashion world, a scar that would never fade. The questions surrounding his death, and the story of the man who took it from him, would linger for years. And in the minds of those who loved him, his vibrant spirit and unique vision would live on. Gianni Versace wasn't just a designer. He was a force, a driving energy that changed the landscape of fashion forever. His death, tragic as it was, would not define him. The legacy he left behind was far too significant. The world had lost a visionary, but his work, his art, and his name would continue to inspire future generations, ensuring that Gianni Versace's mark on fashion would never be erased. Now, stay with us as we go into the chilling story of Kristen Smart and the toxic obsession of Paul Flores that led to her disappearance and death. Part 2. The Murder of Kristen Smart by Paul Flores. On May 25, 1996, the small college town of San Luis Obispo, California, was rocked by an event no one saw coming. Kristen Smart, a bright, ambitious college student with a promising future, disappeared without a trace. One minute, she was walking home from a party, laughing with friends, the next, gone. Her disappearance was immediate and terrifying, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit university community. What happened to her? Break time equals 0. 5s/. Where did she go? The police had few leads, and the mystery surrounding her last moments only deepened with time. But there was one chilling fact that soon emerged. The last person to see Kristen alive was someone who seemed, at first, like just another face in the crowd. He was Paul Flores. To most, Paul Flores was a quiet, seemingly harmless college student. But to Kristen Smart, he was someone she barely knew, just another guy at the party. Yet, this man would soon be revealed as the key to solving one of the most perplexing and disturbing mysteries in the history of California. The connection between Kristen and Paul was brief, but it proved to be deadly. Let's go into the college details. San Luis Obispo in 1996 was a typical college town. The streets were alive with the carefree energy of youth, as students filled the local bars and parties, enjoying their freedom away from home. The air was thick with the sounds of laughter, music, and the promise of endless summer days. For Kristen Smart, it was supposed to be the best time of her life. She was a freshman at California Polytechnic State University, a young woman with a future full of possibilities. She was known for her friendly smile, her drive to succeed, and her love for college life. Everyone who knew her loved her. She had everything to look forward to. But on that fateful night, something went horribly wrong. Kristen had attended a party at a fraternity house, the usual college scene, where there are friends, drinks, and laughter. But as the night wore on, she decided to make the short walk back to her dorm alone. It was a decision she would never regret, and one that would mark the beginning of a tragic turn. Paul Flores, who had been at the party, offered to walk her home. They were seen walking together, but what happened after that, no one knows. Kristen Smart would never be seen alive again. What later happened? What drove Paul Flores to commit such a horrifying act? And why, for years, did this case remain unsolved? Stay with us as we reveal the chilling events surrounding Kristen Smart's disappearance and the man who would eventually be exposed as her killer. Let's start with each person's life story. Kristen Smart was just 19 years old when she stepped onto the campus of California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She had come from a tight-knit family in Stockton, California, and was the kind of person who left a mark on everyone she met. Bright, warm, and full of life, Kristen had big dreams. She wasn't just any student. She was a young woman with a clear sense of purpose. Her ambitions were already evident to those around her. She was studying environmental design, aiming to shape the world in a positive way. She wanted to make a difference, whether that was through her studies or the way she treated the people around her. Kristen had a special way of making people feel welcome. She had an infectious laugh and a spirit that was easy to gravitate toward. She was always surrounded by friends, people who admired her for her kindness, her work ethic, and her authenticity. Her friends described her as someone who had the world at her feet. She loved the college experience, parties, making new connections, and building her future, but she never lost sight of who she was. Kristen had always dreamed big. Whether it was a late-night study session or a day out in the sun with her friends, she always gave her best. In her first year at college, she had already made a name for herself, not just in her academic pursuits, but in the way she made everyone around her feel at ease. But Kristen's life would take a tragic turn just months into her freshman year. On a night that started out like any other, it was May 25, 1996, the weekend before finals. The sun had set on the small college town, and Kristen, like so many other students, was out having fun. She had attended a party at a fraternity house, something familiar in the world of college life. Like most students, she was winding down with a few drinks and the company of her friends. And it was at that party, amid the laughter and chatter, that Kristen would cross paths with Paul Flores. Paul Flores wasn't anyone who stood out in the crowd. He was an average college student, quiet, reserved, and seemingly harmless. Paul had enrolled at Cal Poly at the same time as Kristen, and like many students, he blended into the background. He wasn't someone who commanded attention, nor did he appear to have any malicious intentions at first. He was known to his peers as just another student trying to navigate the social dynamics of college life. At that time, no one could have predicted that he would later be at the center of one of the most haunting disappearances in California's history. Paul's history, though, was far more complicated than it appeared. Beneath the surface of the quiet, average student lay a young man who struggled with deep insecurities. He came from a broken home, with a father who was absent and a mother who struggled to control his erratic behavior. Paul had never developed healthy relationships with women, and it was clear that his emotional development had been stunted in some way. He had an unsettling need for attention and approval, which was especially evident when it came to his interactions with women. Kristen, by contrast, was effortlessly social. She didn't have to try hard to make friends. People gravitated toward her. But for Paul, this was something different. He noticed her at the party, as many people did. But where others saw a new acquaintance, Paul saw something more, which was a chance to become closer to someone who had, in his mind, become an object of desire. What started as a simple exchange of pleasantries between Paul and Kristen that night would soon morph into something far darker. Kristen, in her typical fashion, was kind and friendly to Paul. She was just being herself, chatting with someone at the party, engaging in casual conversation like she would with any other person. But to Paul, this simple interaction, this harmless exchange, wasn't just casual. It became something more, something that fed his growing obsession with her. For Paul Flores, every friendly word, every smile Kristen gave him, became a message. He misinterpreted her kindness as romantic interest. It wasn't long before he became fixated on her, convinced that she was interested in him in a way that she simply wasn't. This belief was a dangerous delusion, one that would twist his perception of reality. Paul's obsession grew rapidly, despite Kristen's lack of interest in him. She didn't see Paul in that way. She was a friendly, open person, but she wasn't romantically attracted to him. She wasn't leading him on, nor was she giving him any reason to believe that she was. But to Paul, her friendliness, her basic human decency, was something much more than it was. Paul began to follow Kristen, showing up at places she frequented, showing interest in her personal life. His obsession grew stronger with each passing day. Every time he saw her with other people, or noticed her not paying him the kind of attention he craved, it fueled his jealousy and anger. His inability to handle rejection, real or perceived, began to manifest in unhealthy ways. His fixation on Kristen became toxic. He wanted her in a way that no one else could understand. And when it became clear that she wasn't interested, that feeling of rejection began to turn into something far darker. Kristen, on the other hand, remained unaware of Paul's growing obsession. She continued living her college life, surrounded by friends, focused on her studies, and enjoying the social freedoms that came with being a young woman in college. But she had no idea that someone she had casually spoken to at a party had become consumed by the idea of her. And for Paul, the more he was rejected, the more he began to lose control. Unfortunately, the night of May 25, 1996, would be the last time Kristen would ever walk across that campus alive. After the party, as was typical for many students, she decided to make her way back to her dorm. It was only a short walk, a walk she had made countless times before. Kristen made her way to the street, just a short walk to her dorm. Paul Flores, who had been lingering around the party, saw the opportunity and offered to walk her home. She accepted, not thinking anything of it. He was a fellow student, someone she knew but barely interacted with. For Paul, this was everything. It was his moment to gain some form of control over the situation, to have the chance to be close to Kristen in a way he had long fantasized about. What seemed like a simple, innocent interaction to Kristen was, in Paul's mind, the beginning of something he believed he had to have. The moment they left the party was the last time anyone saw Kristen alive. As they walked through the streets of San Luis Obispo, no one knew that this would be the final time anyone would see Kristen Smart alive. The exact details of their interaction remain unclear, but what is certain is that somewhere along that quiet street, things went terribly wrong. The clear truth was, Kristen never made it back to her dorm. Her disappearance, sudden and inexplicable, set off a frantic search by her friends and family. Kristen's disappearance was immediate and devastating. Paul, however, returned to his dorm that night, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. He had done what he set out to do, but in the hours and days that followed, the extent of his actions would become painfully clear, and a community would be left searching for answers they would not get easily. The morning after, when Kristen didn't show up for her exam, concern quickly turned to panic. Her friends had been trying to reach her all morning, but she hadn't answered her phone. She was nowhere to be found. Kristen wasn't someone who would skip out on schoolwork, and her sudden absence set off alarms. Her friends began retracing her steps, speaking to everyone who had seen her the night before, hoping someone might have information. Paul Flores, the last person to have seen her, was questioned by the police. He claimed that after offering to walk her home, they parted ways, with Kristen heading in the direction of her dorm. However, there was no confirmation of this. No witnesses. No one had seen her walking away from him. His story was vague, and there were inconsistencies in his account. His behavior was cold, almost indifferent, while Kristen's friends and family were left searching for any sign of her. As the investigation deepened, the authorities began to scrutinize Paul's actions more closely. There was something unnerving about the way he acted. He wasn't showing the kind of concern one would expect from the last person to see a young woman alive. His lack of remorse, the detachment in his demeanor, seemed strange, and questions began to mount. Why wasn't he more worried? Why wasn't he helping in the search? Paul's behavior raised red flags, and the police began to connect the dots. The search for Kristen continued for days, with volunteers, friends, and police scouring the campus and surrounding areas, hoping to find some trace of her. Flyers with Kristen's face were posted everywhere, but as time passed, the chances of finding her grew slimmer. The police started to question whether she had been kidnapped or worse, murdered, but without any physical evidence to support these theories, the case remained stagnant. There were no leads, no clues to indicate what had really happened. The breakthrough came when the authorities began to dig into Paul Flores's past. His history of suspicious behavior, including incidents of harassment and an unsettling tendency to fixate on women, began to paint a more troubling picture. The more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Paul's involvement, his refusal to cooperate, and the details of his story, none of it added up. What had started as a search for a missing person now seemed to be taking the shape of a much darker case. Despite the growing suspicions, the search for Kristen's body turned up nothing. In the early days, there was little evidence to suggest foul play, but everything about Paul's behavior suggested he was hiding something, and that something darker was at play. The police had no physical evidence, and Kristen's body remained elusive, but the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were becoming clearer. It wasn't until much later, when more advanced forensic evidence came to light, that the full horror of Kristen's fate began to take shape. The chilling truth emerged slowly, revealing Paul's involvement and his role in her tragic end. But the mystery remained, with many unanswered questions about the why and how of it all. Why did Paul do it? What drove him to murder someone he barely knew? For Kristen's family, the emotional toll of not knowing what happened to their daughter, their sister, was devastating. Every new lead that came in only seemed to raise more questions and offer fewer answers. The case dragged on, becoming one of those unsolved mysteries that left everyone feeling helpless. But as the investigation continued, Paul Flores's role in Kristen's death became undeniable. How exactly did the authorities find out? Keep watching. In the years following Kristen Smart's disappearance, Paul Flores's behavior made it clear that he had no remorse for what he had done. His cold indifference became a hallmark of his actions during the investigation. He remained almost eerily nonchalant, never once offering any genuine help in the search for Kristen. When questioned by authorities, Paul stuck to his story with no emotion, repeating the same vague details about his last interaction with Kristen. His responses were always evasive, lacking any genuine concern or urgency that someone in his position might have. This lack of empathy, and his refusal to cooperate, led investigators to question whether he was more involved than he let on. His stonewalling continued for years, frustrating investigators who were desperately trying to piece together what happened to Kristen. Paul's refusal to fully cooperate was not just suspicious, it was strategic. He expertly manipulated the situation to avoid being implicated in her disappearance. For years, he stayed just one step ahead of the investigation, knowing exactly how to avoid the authorities' grasp. But every time he refused to talk or dodged the police's inquiries, the suspicion surrounding him grew stronger. Over time, the case grew cold. As months turned into years, the leads became fewer, and the search for Kristen slowed. Without a body, without solid evidence, and with Paul Flores stonewalling the investigation, the case seemed to hit a dead end. Law enforcement faced a mounting frustration, knowing that they were so close yet unable to make progress. As the years passed, the case started to fade from the public eye, becoming another tragic story lost in the sea of unsolved mysteries. But Kristen's family never stopped. Her mother, Denise, in particular, became an unwavering force in the fight for justice. She kept Kristen's case alive, tirelessly speaking out, attending rallies, and pushing for renewed efforts to solve the crime. Her determination served as a beacon for the family and the community, reminding everyone that the truth was still out there, and that Kristen was not forgotten. And then, in 2007, a breakthrough. After years of stagnation, law enforcement was able to revisit the case with a fresh set of eyes. New forensic methods and technologies had advanced, and investigators were able to go back to the evidence they already had. A more in-depth look into Paul Flores's life and background revealed disturbing patterns of behavior, his history of fixation on women, his manipulative tendencies, and his continued evasion of responsibility for Kristen's disappearance. These new findings brought renewed attention to the case, and investigators began re-examining every detail, every clue that had been left behind. The real turning point came when authorities, after years of attempting to track down any leads, discovered new forensic evidence that directly tied Paul Flores to the crime. A search of his family home led to the discovery of critical information, evidence that had been overlooked before. Forensic experts found traces of evidence that pointed unmistakably to Paul as the person responsible for Kristen's murder. But the case still lacked one critical element: the body. In 2019, more than 2 decades after Kristen disappeared, the search for her body was finally successful. Using the new evidence, investigators were able to pinpoint the area near Paul's home where Kristen's remains were found. It wasn't just the location that was chilling, it was the discovery itself. Kristen's body had been hidden for so many years, buried in a place no one had thought to look, lying undisturbed all this time. The remains confirmed what authorities had feared. Kristen had been murdered, and Paul Flores had been responsible all along. The discovery of Kristen's body, while offering some closure, also raised more questions. The emotional impact on her family was immeasurable. After all these years, they could finally say goodbye to their beloved daughter, sister, and friend. But the grief was accompanied by anger and confusion. Why had Paul Flores done it? What drove him to murder Kristen, a young woman who barely knew him and had shown him nothing but kindness? Was it truly just an obsession gone too far, or was there something more behind the crime? These questions lingered, and while the arrest of Paul Flores was a significant step forward, the answers were still out of reach. Kristen's legacy, however, was clear. Her case remained one of the most talked about missing person cases in California's history, and her family's tireless pursuit of justice became a symbol for other families whose loved ones went missing under similar circumstances. Through her family's grief and unwavering pursuit of the truth, Kristen's story continued to resonate with people across the country. In the aftermath of the discovery and Flores's arrest, Kristen's story was no longer just about a tragedy. It became a proof to the strength of those who fight for justice, no matter how long it takes. Kristen's family, particularly her mother, became advocates for the missing and for those whose cases remain unsolved. Through their perseverance, they not only found closure for Kristen, but also helped shine a light on the broader issue of unsolved missing persons cases. Let's head into the third event surrounding the murder of Mary. Part 3. The Murder of Mary Fagan by Leo Frank. On the morning of April 27, 1913, a 13-year-old girl's lifeless body was found in the basement of the National Pencil Company in Atlanta, Georgia. Mary Fagan, a young factory worker with a bright future ahead of her, had been brutally murdered. Her death sent shockwaves through the small town, but what followed would leave the entire nation gripped with controversy and suspicion. The factory's superintendent, Leo Frank, a Jewish man from New York, was arrested for the crime. His conviction sparked national outrage, not only because of the brutal murder of an innocent child, but because of the intense questions surrounding his guilt and the disturbing forces of race, class, and prejudice that seemed to be at play. The case goes on to expose a deeply fractured justice system and reveal how unchecked obsession and rumors could influence the fate of a man. How did it happen? What went wrong? We're about to find out. Georgia in 1913 was a place still recovering from the scars of the Civil War. The tensions between the North and South were still palpable, with old grudges and fresh wounds coloring social dynamics. Atlanta, however, was emerging as a city of industry, where new businesses were growing and railroads were stretching their iron spines across the state. It was a city of change, a symbol of the South's new face, yet one that still struggled with its past. Small towns like Atlanta had the hustle and bustle of modern life, but there was also an undercurrent of suspicion and a rigid social structure. In this climate, a crime like Mary's murder felt like a shock to the community, but it would also soon become a battleground for deeper social issues. Mary Fagan's murder was the type of tragedy that could happen anywhere in America's rapidly industrializing world. A young girl working in a factory, trying to make a living for her family, killed while walking home from work. It was a story that should have been about loss, about the senseless violence that could befall anyone. But this case quickly grew into something far more complex. Leo Frank, the man at the center of it all, wasn't just a factory superintendent. He was an outsider, a Jew in a town where anti-Semitic sentiments ran deep. His marriage to Lucille Frank was known to be distant and, by some accounts, troubled. He was also rumored to have been involved in an affair with one of the young girls at the factory, a rumor that would soon evolve into a whispering campaign that placed him as the prime suspect in Mary's murder. The arrest of Leo Frank was immediate, but it wasn't clear-cut. The evidence was shaky, the testimony unreliable. Still, public opinion quickly turned against him. Was he guilty of this horrendous crime, or was he the victim of a public spectacle? Someone to blame when a tragedy needed a face? The investigation and trial would unfold with the same mix of emotional intensity and social dynamics that had always plagued the South. But now the eyes of the nation were on this case. Could a man be judged fairly, or would his fate be decided by the prejudice and passions of the time? This story, which began as a tragic murder of a young girl, would become a larger tale about obsession, justice, and the intersection of race, class, and power. As we move forward, we'll unravel the emotional dynamics that turned a factory superintendent's life upside down, the investigation that exposed deep divides in the community, and the trial that revealed the true cost of a miscarriage of justice. Who exactly was Mary? Mary Fagan was only 13 years old, but her life was already shaped by the harsh realities of early 20th century America. Born into a poor family in the industrial South, Mary's days were consumed with hard work and the struggle to get by. She lived in a modest home in Atlanta with her mother, who worked as a laundress, and her stepfather, a miner. With few opportunities for education or a better life, young Mary found herself working long hours at the National Pencil Company, a factory that employed many young girls like her. The work was grueling, with little regard for the health or safety of the workers, who were often seen as disposable by their employers. Mary, like many other children of her time, spent her days in a factory, performing repetitive tasks in harsh conditions. The hours were long, and the pay was minimal, just enough to help support her family. She wasn't alone, as many other young girls were employed in similar conditions, trying to earn their way in a world that offered few opportunities to those without wealth or status. It was a time when child labor was rampant in America, and the lives of young girls like Mary were shaped by a system that valued work over childhood, over education, and over well-being. Despite the tough circumstances, Mary was known to be a sweet-natured, hard-working girl. She was well-liked by her fellow workers, many of whom were young girls just like her. She had a kind, innocent personality and a playful spirit that shone through even in the grim environment of the factory. She dreamed of a better life, one where she could escape the poverty that weighed her down. But for now, her life was confined to the factory floor, and she did what she could to help her family. In the few brief moments outside of work, Mary's life was a typical one for a young girl of her time. She played with friends, helped her mother with household chores, and attended church on Sundays. She was on the cusp of adolescence, her whole future still ahead of her, but tragically, that future would be taken from her on that fateful day in April 1913. On the day she was murdered, Mary had worked her usual shift at the National Pencil Company. After finishing her work, she made her way to the front gate of the factory to collect her pay, as was customary for employees. But this day, unlike others, would end in tragedy. She had made arrangements to meet her friends afterward, but Mary never showed up. The following morning, her lifeless body was discovered in the factory's basement. Imagine the shock. The murder of a 13-year-old girl in a small, close-knit community like Atlanta was a horrifying crime. But it became even more complicated when the focus of the investigation shifted to Leo Frank, the factory superintendent, a man whose life and background were far more entangled in the case than anyone could have imagined. But who was Leo himself? Leo Frank had moved to Georgia from Brooklyn, New York, a few years earlier, taking up a position as the superintendent at the National Pencil Company. He was a Jewish man in a town where anti-Semitic sentiments ran deep. Frank was already an outsider. He was a man of northern origin, someone who didn't fully understand the intricacies of Southern life, particularly the prejudices that came with it. Frank's background was one of privilege. He had received a good education in New York and had come to Georgia to take on a leadership role at the factory, a factory that, despite its grim reputation, provided a steady source of income for families like Mary's. From the beginning, Frank's relationship with the local community was strained. He was seen as an outsider, a Yankee, and his Jewish heritage made him a target of suspicion in a town where Southern pride and Protestantism were deeply ingrained. His lack of local roots, coupled with his position of authority in the factory, made him a figure of resentment for many. Frank was an educated, self-assured man, but in the eyes of many locals, he was a reminder of everything they resented about the changing South: the Northern influence, the immigrant presence, and the evolving social order. Frank's strained relationship with the local community also extended to his personal life. He was married to Lucille Frank, but their relationship was far from perfect. Lucille, who had grown up in the South, was a Southern belle by all accounts, quiet, reserved, and very much aware of her social standing. The couple's marriage had been complicated from the start. There were rumors that Leo Frank had been involved in an affair, and these whispers would eventually form a part of the tragic narrative surrounding Mary Fagan's murder. But despite their personal difficulties, there was no concrete evidence to suggest that their marriage was anything other than troubled by normal human flaws. The rumors of infidelity, however, added a layer of tension to the situation and would soon play into the unfolding drama. Frank's relationship with his factory workers, including the young girls like Mary Fagan, was also complicated. While there was no definitive proof of any inappropriate behavior, Frank's role as the superintendent meant that he was frequently in close contact with the young women working under him. The factory was known for employing young girls, and their relationship with Frank became an issue during the investigation into Mary's murder. Some of the girls spoke of his mannerisms and behavior, but none of them had ever reported anything outright suspicious. Still, the rumors persisted. The whispers of Frank's alleged involvement with young girls, the perceived closeness between him and certain factory workers, and the jealousy that often arose among his female employees would play a significant role in the aftermath of the murder. When Mary Fagan's body was discovered, many of these rumors began to swirl. Mary was last seen leaving the factory on the afternoon of April 26th, and she passed through the factory gates on her way home. She was seen briefly by Leo Frank, who, according to some accounts, spoke to her as she left. The next morning to her dead body discovery. The question is, was Frank involved? Had something happened between them that led to the tragic events of that night? As the investigation unfolded, the questions surrounding Frank's involvement would only intensify. In the days following Mary's murder, Leo Frank's actions were scrutinized. His behavior seemed suspicious, he was evasive when questioned, and some witnesses said he had acted strangely after the murder. But the most damning piece of evidence came when Jim Conley, an African-American janitor at the factory, was implicated in the crime. Conley's testimony, despite inconsistencies and contradictions, painted Frank as a man who had been involved in the crime. Frank's arrest and subsequent trial would ignite a wave of public outcry, not only because of the brutal nature of Mary's murder, but also because it became a battleground for issues far greater than one man's guilt. As the case progressed, the emotions surrounding it became tangled with racial tensions, religious prejudice, and the growing divide between Northern and Southern values. Now, back to Mary's dead body and details surrounding it. The discovery was nothing short of horrific. Just hours after she had left work, her lifeless form was found in the basement of the National Pencil Company. In the morning of April 27, 1913, she was still missing since the previous afternoon. As authorities investigated her whereabouts, they uncovered a gruesome scene. Mary's body was discovered by a factory worker who stumbled upon it in the basement while searching for her. She had been brutally attacked. Her face was swollen, bruised, and bloodied. Her body showed signs of physical violence, including signs of strangulation and sexual assault. The brutality of the murder left little doubt that this was not a crime of passion, but one marked by anger and rage. The discovery of her body sent a wave of shock throughout the city of Atlanta, but the investigation into the crime quickly turned into something far more complex than a simple murder. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on Leo Frank. As the factory superintendent, he was one of the last people to see Mary alive. He had been in the factory late the previous afternoon, and he was the one who reportedly spoke with Mary as she left. Although there was no direct evidence linking Frank to the crime at that point, his position as the last known person to have interacted with the victim made him the prime suspect in the eyes of the authorities. The investigation into Mary's murder was swift. The police, under immense pressure to solve the case quickly, began questioning everyone in the factory. They spoke to Frank, who appeared calm and collected, but his responses were notably evasive and inconsistent. His lack of visible emotion also raised eyebrows. Some believed that someone in his position would have been more upset about the death of a young girl working under his supervision. Frank's refusal to fully cooperate with authorities during questioning only increased suspicion, especially when it was revealed that his initial statements didn't quite align with the facts. The more Frank spoke, the more certain it seemed that something didn't add up. But Frank's behavior alone wasn't enough to secure a conviction. The investigation seemed to be going nowhere until a crucial figure came forward: Jim Conley, an African-American factory worker. Conley was questioned by police after Frank's arrest, and his testimony quickly became a key part of the case. Conley initially denied any involvement in the murder, but after hours of questioning, he ultimately gave a confession. According to Conley, he had witnessed Frank and Mary in the factory after hours, and he claimed to have seen Frank attack her. He went on to allege that Frank had asked him to help move Mary's body into the basement and then help to cover up the crime. Conley's testimony, while full of inconsistencies, became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. His narrative of events was shocking, painting Frank as a cold-blooded murderer, and in the eyes of the public, it appeared to be the final piece of the puzzle. But despite Conley's dramatic confession, his credibility was questioned by Frank's defense team. Conley had a criminal record, and his confession was riddled with contradictions. Some believed he had fabricated parts of his story to save himself from being implicated in the murder. Others thought that Conley had been coerced into making the confession by the police. Nonetheless, Conley's testimony was enough to persuade a jury, and Leo Frank was arrested and charged with the murder of Mary Fagan. As the investigation progressed, public sentiment in Atlanta grew increasingly tense. This wasn't just a case of a brutal murder, it was a battle of power, class, and race. Leo Frank, a Jewish man from New York, had already faced suspicion from the beginning due to his status as an outsider. Many in the South viewed him as a symbol of the Northern influence they resented, a reminder of the cultural and social divisions that remained in the post-Civil War South. His heritage played a role in the growing distrust that surrounded him, and soon, the murder case became a focal point for deep-seated prejudices. The media played a significant role in this atmosphere of fear and anger. Newspapers across Georgia, and particularly in Atlanta, began publishing sensationalist headlines and stories that painted Frank as guilty before the trial even began. The press capitalized on Frank's outsider status, framing him as a dangerous foreigner who was different from the hard-working, native Southerners who made up the heart of the city. Anti-Semitic rhetoric was rampant in the media, with some newspapers openly calling for Frank's conviction based on his religion and background, rather than any concrete evidence. As the case developed, it became clear that the murder of Mary Fagan had turned into a larger spectacle, a clash of values and social identities. The city's emotional temperature reached a boiling point as the case took on a life of its own, becoming an almost mythical struggle between the good Southern folk and the evil outsider. Frank's trial, which began in July 1913, was covered in every detail by the media. The court became a battleground where public opinion seemed to weigh more heavily than the actual facts. Leo Frank's trial was nothing short of a media circus. The courtroom was packed every day, with crowds of spectators eager to see the drama unfold. The prosecution relied heavily on Jim Conley's testimony, portraying him as a key eyewitness to the crime. Frank's defense team, on the other hand, worked to discredit Conley's version of events. They pointed to inconsistencies in his statements, his criminal history, and the possibility that he had been coerced into confessing. They also argued that Frank had been framed by someone within the factory, but they were unable to provide any solid evidence to support this theory. The trial was also a contest of emotional and psychological dynamics. The prosecution used Mary Fagan's tragic story to stir up public sympathy, while the defense painted Leo Frank as a victim of a flawed justice system, a man who had been wrongly accused because of his background and the prejudices that surrounded him. The case took on a life of its own, with both sides playing to the public in ways that obscured the actual facts of the case. Despite the doubts surrounding Conley's testimony, the jury convicted Leo Frank on August 25, 1913. He was sentenced to death, though his legal team quickly appealed the conviction, arguing that the trial had been tainted by prejudice and public hysteria. The appeals process seemed like it might offer Frank a second chance, until mob violence took matters into their own hands. The trial and its aftermath became a symbol of the deep divisions in American society during that time, between race, religion, class, and justice. For Leo Frank, it wasn't just about his trial. It was about what his case represented: the collision of old Southern values with the changing realities of the early 20th century. And for Mary Fagan's family, the case was about something else entirely: the brutal, senseless loss of their young daughter, whose life had been cut short by violence, and the subsequent fight for justice that would define their lives. As the trial ended, many questions about Leo Frank's guilt remained unanswered. Was he guilty of murder, or was he the victim of a cruel system that had already decided his fate? This case, which started with the murder of a young girl, would grow into one of the most controversial and complex legal battles in American history. But, for now, the question of justice for Mary Fagan and for Leo Frank was far from settled. After Leo Frank's conviction and the subsequent legal battle for a retrial, a tragic and horrifying chapter in the case unfolded. Frank's supporters, including prominent public figures and legal advocates, pushed tirelessly for a commutation or retrial. They argued that Frank had been convicted unfairly, citing the lack of solid evidence and the racial prejudices that had tainted the trial. However, Before any legal process could unfold, the anger that had been simmering in Georgia's heartland for months boiled over into mob violence. On the night of August 16, 1915, a group of outraged citizens, many of whom were from Frank's home state of Georgia, broke into the prison where Frank was being held. They kidnapped him, ignoring any semblance of due process or justice. The mob dragged Frank out of his cell, forcibly removed him from the prison, and took him to a nearby forest just outside of Marietta, Georgia. There, they lynched him, hanging him from a tree in the dead of night. The lynching of Leo Frank was swift and brutal, an act of mob justice that bypassed the rule of law entirely. It was a tragic and violent end to a case already fraught with controversy and injustice. The mob believed they were delivering their own brand of justice, but in reality, they were condemning a man without legal or moral grounds. The act was a reminder of the depths of racial, religious, and class tensions that still plagued the South. The brutality of the lynching shocked the nation and highlighted the dark realities of mob mentality, prejudice, and the complete disregard for legal proceedings when emotions ran high. The impact of Frank's lynching reverberated far beyond the confines of Georgia. It raised profound questions about the justice system, the treatment of minorities, and the systemic anti-Semitism that existed in the South. Leo Frank's death became a flashpoint in a national debate over race and religion, especially as the case drew attention to the tragic consequences of prejudice. The incident struck a nerve across the United States, and what had once been a local legal battle quickly became a symbol of something much larger: the widespread injustice faced by minority communities, particularly Jews, in the early 20th century. In the wake of Frank's death, protests erupted across the country. Civil rights activists, Jewish communities, and other concerned citizens condemned the lynching as a dangerous precedent for mob rule and a travesty of justice. The lynching also sparked the creation of the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, an organization founded in 1913 with the mission of fighting anti-Semitism and defending the rights of Jewish people. The ADL would go on to play a pivotal role in advocating for Jewish rights and combating discrimination, using the Frank case as a rallying point for their work. The lynching also had a lasting effect on the broader legal and political landscape. It highlighted the flaws in the justice system and how racial and religious bias could influence verdicts, both in the courtroom and in public opinion. The outrage surrounding Frank's death led to calls for reforming legal procedures, particularly in southern states, where the deep-seated prejudice and discriminatory practices were most rampant. Frank's death also forced the country to confront its own issues with mob justice, demonstrating the dangers of bypassing due process in favor of vengeance. While Leo Frank's tragic end became a rallying cry for civil rights movements, it also left an indelible mark on the memory of Mary Fagan, the young girl whose murder had sparked the entire series of events. Mary's death, and the way her murder was weaponized in the public sphere, became a symbol of the exploitation of children in the workforce and the disregard for the lives of the poor. Mary Fagan's story resonated with people across the nation, shining a spotlight on the injustices faced by child laborers, particularly in the South. Her death, though horrific and senseless, highlighted the dangerous working conditions in factories that employed young children like her. Her tragic story was remembered in the growing conversation about labor rights. Books, films, and documentaries would later recount the events surrounding Mary's death, ensuring that her memory and the lessons learned from her life and death would not be forgotten. Reflecting on the case, it becomes clear that the murder of Mary Fagan and the subsequent trial and lynching of Leo Frank represented more than just a single, isolated incident. The case touched on some of the deepest societal issues of the time: the racial and religious tensions, class struggles, and the fundamental flaws in the justice system. While Frank's supporters and critics debated his guilt or innocence, the events surrounding his trial and lynching exposed the deep divides that still ran through American society. It showed how prejudice and mob mentality could overpower reason, and how the lives of people like Leo Frank, Mary Fagan, and their families were often shaped by forces beyond their control. Even now, many still question whether Frank was guilty of the crime or whether he was simply a victim of circumstance, hysteria, and societal fears. The case remains controversial to this day, with ongoing debates about his innocence or guilt and the broader implications of his trial. The case has also become a focal point for those who study the intersection of race, religion, and law in America. It serves as a tragic reminder of the dangers of prejudice, the importance of a fair trial, and the horrific consequences that can arise when justice is manipulated by fear, hatred, and societal divisions. In the end, it was Mary Fagan's tragic death that ultimately remained at the heart of the case. Her life, short as it was, became a symbol of the exploitation of children and the fight for better working conditions. The questions raised by the case, about guilt, innocence, and the miscarriage of justice, continue to resonate today, making the story of Mary Fagan and Leo Frank a haunting and powerful chapter in American history. Now, you're about to watch the next story. Sit tight and grab your popcorn. Part 4. The Murder of Kitty Genovese. In the early hours of March 13, 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked in the streets of Queens, New York. What should have been a routine night for the 28-year-old woman, who was returning home from her job at a bar, turned into a chilling nightmare that would later become one of the most infamous cases in American history. What made this murder so deeply disturbing wasn't just the violence of the attack, but the apathy of the community. Despite the fact that many had witnessed part of the assault, no one called the police and no one stepped in to help her. The case of Kitty Genovese became a national shockwave, sparking intense discussions about human nature, morality, and the emotional detachment in an increasingly urbanized society. Kitty's death would go on to highlight the dark phenomenon known as bystander apathy, the tragic tendency for people to avoid helping in emergency situations when others are present. In Kitty's case, the bystanders didn't just fail to act. They turned a blind eye to the cries for help that echoed into the night. What went wrong? Well, keep watching to find out. New York City in the early 1960s was a city of extremes. On one hand, it was a vibrant, bustling metropolis filled with energy, promise, and the excitement of new opportunities. The city was growing rapidly, fueled by post-war economic prosperity and the rise of the Cultural Revolution. New York seemed to be alive with movement, creativity, and innovation. But beneath the surface of this thriving, fast-paced city lay a darker side, a side defined by anonymity, crowded streets, and a sense of isolation that permeated its urban landscape. In the dense, crowded neighborhoods, people were more often than not strangers to each other. It was easy to blend into the background and easier still to ignore the suffering of others when surrounded by the noise and chaos of city life. The contrast between New York's outward energy and the emotional disconnect that could allow something as horrific as Kitty Genovese's murder to occur is striking. The city's sense of urgency and constant movement created an environment in which people were too preoccupied with their own lives to engage with those around them. And in Kitty's case, this emotional disconnect was not just an abstract idea. It was a tangible and deadly force. Kitty Genovese, like so many other young women in New York, was full of life. She had moved to the city from Brooklyn, seeking independence and a career in a new world filled with excitement and promise. She worked as a bar manager and was well-liked by her colleagues and friends. Kitty was known for her friendliness, ambition, and her vibrant energy. She had big dreams and a bright future, always pushing forward despite the challenges she faced. She was a young woman with a life ahead of her, a life that was brutally stolen in the most tragic and preventable way. Her death forced society to reckon with the chilling reality of how often people ignore or fail to engage with the suffering of others, particularly when they feel disconnected from the situation or when they assume someone else will take responsibility. This case would go on to forever alter how we think about intervention, compassion, and the failure of community responsibility. Who was Kitty? Where is she from? Kitty Genovese's story begins in Brooklyn, New York, in 1935. Born to a large, working-class Italian-American family, she grew up in a neighborhood defined by its tight-knit community. Her family was hardworking, with her parents doing their best to provide for the household, despite the struggles that came with raising a family in New York during the 1930s and 1940s. Kitty, the second of 3 children, was known for her warm, outgoing personality. She was a woman who loved life, filled with optimism and a strong sense of independence that would eventually lead her to seek a life outside of Brooklyn. Kitty's early years were marked by a sense of community. She was loved by those who knew her, and her friendly nature made her a natural to form close relationships. She was the kind of person who could brighten a room with her smile, and she possessed a work ethic that matched her energy. As she got older, Kitty's desire to make a life for herself outside the constraints of her upbringing became more evident. Brooklyn was her home, but she knew there was a wider world out there, and she wanted to explore it. In the early 1960s, Kitty moved to the neighborhood of Kew Gardens in Queens, looking for more opportunities and a fresh start. She found a job at a bar in the city, where she became known for her hard work and friendly demeanor. As a young woman in her 20s, Kitty was independent, ambitious, and determined to succeed. Her relationships, both personal and professional, reflected this spirit. She made friends easily, creating a social circle that supported and encouraged her as she navigated her career and adulthood in New York. Her move to Queens marked a significant shift in her life. In Brooklyn, she had lived in a more familiar, close-knit environment, but Kew Gardens was a quieter, more suburban part of the city. It was a neighborhood that, while still part of the hustle and bustle of New York, felt like a small community within the larger, chaotic metropolis. Kitty's career at the bar was flourishing, and she had dreams of further success. She was on her way to creating the life she had always imagined, one where she could have both personal and professional fulfillment. She was independent, self-assured, and full of promise. But the paradox of New York was already beginning to show itself. The very city that offered Kitty the opportunity to build a better future was also a place that could, at times, feel impersonal and cold. Despite the constant activity and the dense population, many people in the city often found themselves feeling isolated, cut off from the very people who surrounded them. New York was, in a sense, a city of extremes. It represented the pinnacle of opportunity, the world's melting pot, a place where people from all over the world could come and carve out a better life. Despite being surrounded by thousands of people, many of New York's residents lived their lives in relative isolation, disconnected from their neighbors and community. This created an environment in which people felt less compelled to help, to intervene, or to act when others were in need. In a city like New York, where the sheer number of people can be overwhelming, many residents develop a sort of bystander effect. They become desensitized to the suffering of others, overwhelmed by the constant noise and activity around them, and detached from their own emotions as a means of coping with the constant stimulation. People in urban environments can become passive, turning a blind eye to the needs of others simply because they are so accustomed to ignoring the world around them. The more witnesses there are, the less likely anyone is to step in. This was exactly what happened in Kitty's case. People simply assumed that someone else would step in, or worse, they didn't want to get involved. This emotional detachment, this unwillingness to intervene, would become central to the tragedy of Kitty's death. In Kitty's case, her murder didn't just shine a light on her killer, Winston Moseley, a man who had no prior connection to Kitty, but had become fixated on her for reasons that were not immediately clear. But it also exposed a larger societal problem. Kitty's death became a symbol of this emotional distance and would soon become an infamous example of how human behavior could be manipulated by the environment around it. Her murder, and the fact that so many people failed to help her, became a catalyst for social and psychological discussions that would last for decades. How could it be that so many people stood by, listening to her cries for help, and did nothing? The case forced society to ask uncomfortable questions about human nature, the responsibility of individuals to one another, and how emotional indifference could manifest in a world where people were surrounded by strangers but had little emotional connection to them. Let's go back to where we started from. On the night of March 13, 1964, Kitty Genovese was finishing her shift at the Happy Land Bar in Queens, New York. It was just after 3 a.m., and the streets were quiet as she walked back to her apartment. Kitty had been working late, but she was used to the late hours. She was independent, confident, and accustomed to the nightlife of the city. As she made her way through the parking lot of her apartment complex, a man approached her, Winston Moseley, a stranger with no prior connection to her. Mosley, a 29-year-old with a history of violent crime, saw an opportunity and decided to act. He attacked Kitty in the darkened parking lot. Kitty screamed for help as Mosley overpowered her, struggling to break free from his grip. At first, her cries were heard by some of her neighbors in the building. She fought back with all her strength, desperately trying to escape. She managed to break free briefly and ran toward the entrance of the apartment building, but Mosley chased her down, tackling her to the ground. Kitty's screams continued as Mosley stabbed her repeatedly, her body left exposed and vulnerable in the parking lot. As the attack went on, Kitty's cries for help grew fainter, but they still carried through the walls of the apartment complex. What was so chilling about this moment wasn't just the violence of the crime, it was the fact that so many people could hear what was happening and do nothing. Kitty's screams echoed through the night, but none of the neighbors who heard her attempted to intervene or call for help. The bystander effect, the psychological phenomenon where people are less likely to offer assistance in an emergency when others are present, played a pivotal role in her tragic death. As the attack unfolded, witnesses remained passive, paralyzed by indifference or fear. Kitty's cries were met with silence from those who could have helped her. Some witnesses later said they assumed someone else would call the police, while others admitted that they simply didn't want to get involved. The attack, which spanned a horrifying 30 to 40 minutes, was not brief or isolated. It was long, drawn-out, and violent, with the entire ordeal happening in full view of the neighbors who remained indifferent to Kitty's plight. One of the most disturbing facts about the case was that no one took action during this crucial period. Not a single person intervened, not one person picked up the phone to dial 911, and not one person came to her aid. As the attack continued, Kitty's cries grew weaker, and eventually, her voice fell silent. Winston Mosley, the man responsible for Kitty's death, was a figure who would later shock the world with his confession and chilling demeanor. Mosley had no personal or emotional connection to Kitty. He was not motivated by love, jealousy, or any personal dispute. Instead, his attack was driven by a detached desire for violence. Mosley was a man who had previously committed other violent crimes, including sexual assault and burglary. He had already been living a life defined by criminality, and his actions that night were just another extension of his complete lack of empathy for human life. When Mosley was apprehended, he confessed not only to the murder of Kitty Genovese but also to several other violent crimes. His demeanor throughout the investigation was disturbingly cold. Mosley showed no remorse for the attack, and his lack of guilt or empathy was chilling. He described the murder of Kitty Genovese in a matter-of-fact way, as though it were simply another action he had taken to satisfy an urge for violence. He was detached from the gravity of his crime, offering no explanation for his actions beyond a general desire to cause harm. The case quickly drew the attention of the media, but it was not just the brutality of the murder that would dominate headlines. The real story that captured the public's attention was the shocking revelation that dozens of people had witnessed the attack but had failed to intervene. The media and authorities were left grappling with an unsettling question. How could so many people hear Kitty's screams and not act? This phenomenon, which would later be coined the Genovese syndrome, became the focal point of widespread discussions about human nature, societal responsibility, and the emotional indifference of modern urban life. The failure of the witnesses to act was seen not just as an isolated incident, but as a symbol of the larger social and psychological issues facing modern society. The police investigation into Kitty Genovese's murder was complicated by the lack of cooperation from witnesses. Despite the fact that many had heard her screams, they were reluctant to speak to the authorities or admit their role in failing to intervene. Some witnesses claimed that they had assumed someone else had called the police, while others were too frightened to get involved. This hesitation, along with the anonymity of urban life, allowed the case to drag on, raising difficult questions about how individuals interact with each other in crowded, impersonal environments. The emotional disconnect that had allowed such an event to unfold was now a critical part of the investigation. Kitty's murder and the subsequent revelations about the apathy of the bystanders would have a profound impact on the case itself. As the media sensationalized the story, questioning the moral responsibility of the witnesses, it became clear that the failure to act was not just an individual flaw but a symptom of a broader social issue. The question became, how could so many people stand by and do nothing when someone was in need of help? Winston Moseley's confession was a chilling moment in the investigation. His complete lack of remorse, coupled with the passive behavior of the witnesses, painted a disturbing picture of the state of society. Kitty's death wasn't just the result of one man's violent actions. It was a reflection of a society where people, despite having the means and opportunity to help, chose not to. The investigation ultimately led to Moseley's conviction, but the psychological and societal implications of the case would continue to resonate for years to come. Kitty Genovese's murder wasn't just a tragic event. It was a landmark case that forever changed how we think about responsibility, community, and human compassion. The case exposed the deep flaws in the way modern urban environments affected individual behavior, highlighting the emotional apathy that could emerge in an environment of crowded isolation. As for the murder of Kitty Genovese, it quickly became a national story that sent shockwaves through the public consciousness. The case was reported widely across newspapers, television, and radio, but the most shocking part wasn't just the brutality of the crime. It was the fact that so many people heard Kitty's screams and yet did nothing to help. The media focused intensely on this failure of the community, sparking a larger conversation about human indifference and moral responsibility. People across the country were horrified at the thought that so many individuals could witness a woman in distress and simply ignore her cries for help. Public outrage grew as the nation questioned how such apathy could be possible in a modern society. How had a community of people allowed something so horrific to happen on their doorstep without lifting a finger to intervene? This public outcry led to a major shift in how society thought about human behavior in times of crisis. The case ignited an urgent need to understand why people fail to act in such situations and why, when confronted with someone in peril, we so often choose to do nothing. Kitty's murder became more than just a tragic event. It became a symbol of the breakdown of collective responsibility in a fast-paced, emotionally detached world. The case raised important moral questions about the role of individuals in a society and the responsibility we have to help one another when in distress. In response to this moral vacuum, psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley began to study the bystander effect in depth. Their research into the Kitty Genovese case and other similar instances led to the conclusion that the more witnesses there are to an emergency, the less likely it is that anyone will help. This is known as the diffusion of responsibility. In essence, when many people are present, the individual feels less personal responsibility to intervene, as they assume that someone else will take action. This phenomenon, which Latané and Darley demonstrated through a series of experiments, was later coined as the Genovese syndrome. Kitty's case became a textbook example of this psychological theory, and it opened a broader societal conversation about how we react, or fail to react, to the suffering of others. As psychologists delved deeper into the causes of bystander apathy, cities across the country began reevaluating their laws and policies regarding crime intervention. Kitty's murder had exposed a deep flaw in how society viewed responsibility, and it prompted many local governments to introduce laws that encouraged or even mandated individuals to report crimes or intervene when they witnessed someone in distress. These changes reflected a growing awareness of the need for stronger community engagement and bystander intervention in emergencies. This shift in attitude marked a cultural transformation, reshaping the way we viewed public responsibility and the moral obligation to help others in need. Kitty's tragic story became a crucial turning point in the study of human behavior and ethics. Her death highlighted the dangers of emotional detachment, and it made people more aware of how easy it is to ignore suffering when it happens outside our immediate sphere of influence. Kitty's case brought attention to the importance of community involvement, not just in preventing crime, but in being present for each other in times of need. It underlined the necessity of fostering empathy in urban environments, where the anonymity of large cities can easily erode our ability to connect with one another. Her case also highlighted the need for better support systems for individuals in crisis. Kitty was not just a victim of a random act of violence. Her murder was the tragic result of a breakdown in the social fabric that should have linked the community together. The failure of neighbors to act during her time of need reflected a society that had lost touch with its fundamental values of empathy, care, and responsibility. Kitty's legacy lives on not only in the lessons of human behavior, but also in the ongoing fight to make cities safer and more compassionate places. Her death still serves as a haunting reminder of how easily human compassion can be disregarded and how, when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of others, we risk becoming numb to the pain that surrounds us. Kitty Genovese's murder wasn't just a tragic loss. It was a wake-up call about the importance of intervening, speaking out, and taking responsibility when we witness someone in pain. Reflecting on Kitty's story, it's clear that her death revealed much more than the cruelty of one individual. It exposed a larger societal indifference and the dangerous effects that emotional detachment can have on the well-being of others. In a modern, urban society, where we are often surrounded by strangers, the deeper question remains: what does it take for people to stand up, to speak out, and to intervene when they witness suffering? Kitty's death was a stark reminder of the perils of unchecked apathy, of a community's unwillingness to engage, and how easily this can lead to tragedy. But in her case, her story has endured, provoking a conversation that continues to challenge our views on responsibility and human empathy. As we reflect on this heartbreaking case, it's clear that Kitty Genovese's murder wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a cultural moment that forced society to reckon with the consequences of emotional detachment and the vital need to foster a more compassionate and responsible community. Next, we'll look at another tragic event that would leave a deep mark on history, where a young woman's death would spark widespread national conversations about justice and responsibility. Stay with us as we go into the story of the murder of Heather Bogle by George Brinkman. Part 5. The Murder of Heather Bogle by George Brinkman. In May of 2017, the quiet town of North Royalton, Ohio, was rocked by a brutal and shocking crime that would shake the community to its core. Heather Bogle, a young woman just beginning to move on from a difficult breakup, was brutally murdered by her ex-boyfriend, George Brinkman. But this wasn't just a senseless act of violence. It was the horrifying culmination of months of obsession, control, and manipulation. Brinkman's toxic and possessive love for Heather drove him to murder her, and ultimately, 2 other women, in a chilling spiral of violence. What started as a broken relationship soon escalated to a tragedy that would leave families torn apart and a community reeling. What led to this tragic event? Keep watching. North Royalton was a peaceful, suburban community, a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where families enjoyed the simple pleasures of small-town life. Heather, 33 years old, worked as a medical assistant and lived a relatively ordinary life. She was the type of woman who, despite her struggles, always tried to make the best of things. After ending her relationship with George Brinkman, Heather was attempting to move forward, trying to find peace and stability after years of emotional turmoil. Her life seemed to be on an upswing, full of promise and new beginnings. But that normalcy would be shattered in the most horrific way. As Heather continued her journey to reclaim her life, George Brinkman, consumed by his obsession with getting her back, couldn't let go. His desire to control Heather, to force her back into his life, turned into something far darker. His inability to accept the breakup led to escalating threats, intimidation, and ultimately violence. The devastating turn of events culminated in Heather's brutal murder, and the discovery that Brinkman's obsession would claim not just 1, but 3 lives. In the early hours of May 19, 2017, Heather's body was discovered, marking the beginning of a long and disturbing investigation. The chilling truth behind her death would soon come to light, revealing how Brinkman's unhealthy fixation on his ex-girlfriend would lead him to murder, and how his violence would continue to devastate the lives of 2 more victims. This wasn't just a case of a man losing control. It was the tragic consequence of obsession, manipulation, and emotional abuse taken to its extreme. What drove George Brinkman to this point? How did a seemingly normal woman's life end in such violence? Stay with us as we unravel the details of this shocking crime and the heartbreaking aftermath. Heather Bogle was born and raised in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, a small-town girl with big dreams and a strong sense of independence. Her upbringing was marked by a family that, like many, struggled to make ends meet, but they instilled in her a strong work ethic and a desire to build a better life for herself. Heather was the kind of person who always seemed to light up a room with her smile and infectious energy. She wasn't just known for her good looks, but for her kind heart and loyalty to her friends and family. As a young woman, Heather found herself juggling her career and personal life while always trying to maintain a positive outlook. She worked as a medical assistant, a job that brought her a sense of fulfillment and purpose. Heather had aspirations of building a stable and rewarding life, one where she could enjoy simple pleasures, like spending time with her family and friends, while still focusing on her goals. She wasn't someone who sought attention or fame, but rather she dreamed of carving out her own niche in the world, where she could be self-sufficient, happy, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her. Her spirit was a reflection of her belief that she deserved happiness, and she was determined to find it despite the setbacks she had encountered along the way. But Heather's relationship with George Brinkman would prove to be one of the greatest challenges she would face. At the time she met him, she was already a woman who had endured the emotional weight of difficult relationships and had worked hard to move beyond them. George was charming, charismatic, and appeared to offer the emotional support she had longed for. At first, their relationship seemed promising, and Heather, ever hopeful and trusting, believed that George was the person who would help her build a brighter future. Unfortunately, as Heather's relationship with George progressed, the charming exterior he presented slowly began to fade. The man who had initially appeared to be caring and supportive showed signs of possessiveness, emotional manipulation, and control. At first, these behaviors were subtle, like small comments about where she went, who she was with, and how often she checked in. But as time went on, Heather began to notice that George's need to control her life was becoming more intense, and his behavior more erratic. She soon realized that George's affection wasn't something she could enjoy freely, without strings attached. It was conditional. He demanded loyalty and control in exchange for his love and attention. As Heather recognized the toxic patterns emerging in the relationship, she tried to maintain her independence while still caring for George. But his possessiveness escalated quickly. He began to restrict her personal freedom, becoming increasingly jealous and controlling. George would constantly question her whereabouts, scrutinize her friendships, and even attempt to isolate her from her family. The more Heather tried to pull away or assert her independence, the more aggressive and manipulative George became. What started as subtle emotional manipulation turned into outright emotional abuse. George Brinkman had a history that hinted at these troubling behaviors long before he crossed paths with Heather. Raised in a family with its own challenges, George's early life was marked by instability. He had a history of failed relationships, many of which ended because of his possessiveness and emotional volatility. Though he often came across as charming, people close to him noticed an underlying darkness, a sense of entitlement and control that seemed to fuel his relationships. Like many abusers, George used charm to win Heather over, but once he had her, he began to chip away at her self-esteem and sense of self-worth, making her feel isolated and dependent on him. His previous relationships had all been marked by similar patterns of emotional control. Those who had been close to him spoke of his jealous fits, his need to dominate every aspect of the relationship, and his inability to handle rejection. But with Heather, things took a darker turn. His obsession with her grew stronger as she tried to break free, unable to accept the idea of losing control over her life. George could not understand or accept Heather's decision to end their relationship. To him, the breakup wasn't just the end of a romance, it was a personal rejection, one that he could not tolerate. The more Heather distanced herself from George, the more desperate he became. The breakup triggered something in him, a deep sense of inadequacy and rejection that seemed to manifest as an overwhelming need to regain control. George, once again, tried to win Heather back using manipulation, guilt, and threats. He couldn't stand the idea of her moving on without him, and that sense of control slipping away made him desperate. Heather, who had already faced so much emotional manipulation, found herself trapped between her desire for independence and George's emotional coercion. In the months following their breakup, George continued to torment Heather, refusing to let go of their past relationship. He would call her, show up at her house uninvited, and engage in harassing behaviors meant to pressure her back into his life. Despite Heather's clear attempts to move on, George refused to accept the end of their relationship. His obsessive behaviors intensified. He even went so far as to threaten her, reminding her of his influence and control over her, which further isolated her. Still, she was determined to maintain her distance. As Heather continued to distance herself from George, she found the strength to regain some control over her own life. She was moving forward, focused on her career and building relationships that were supportive and free from the emotional turmoil that had defined her past with George. She was looking forward to the future, hopeful for new opportunities and a new chapter in her life. However, George's inability to let go of Heather would prove to be fatal. His fixation on winning her back had grown into an obsession, and his need to control her had turned into something far more dangerous. Heather's attempts to assert her independence and her desire to move on with her life only fueled George's obsession. And on that day, it would all result in the brutal murders of Heather and two other women. Women who, like Heather, had been victims of his toxic need for control. Their relationship had been a combination of fleeting moments of charm and deeply disturbing emotional manipulation. George's attempt to force Heather back into his life, through a combination of violence and threats, would lead to a brutal tragedy. What went wrong that murder night? Let's see. The night of May 19, 2017, began like any other for Heather Bogle. She had recently ended her toxic relationship with George Brinkman and was focused on rebuilding her life. After spending time with friends and family, she returned home to North Royalton, Ohio, late that evening, eager to get some rest before starting another busy day. But as the hours passed, Heather would never be seen alive again. The series of events leading to her tragic death began that very night, with George Brinkman's escalating obsession driving him to commit a heinous act. Brinkman had been spiraling ever since the breakup. Unable to accept that Heather no longer wanted him in her life, he became consumed by his feelings of rejection. His need to regain control over Heather had intensified, and his behavior had become more erratic and threatening. He had been trying to manipulate and coerce her into getting back together with him again, sending her messages, showing up at her workplace, and even resorting to intimidation tactics to force her back into the relationship. Despite Heather's attempts to distance herself, Brinkman's obsession with her was relentless, and he could not accept her decision to move on. That evening, Brinkman's frustrations boiled over. He knew that Heather had been trying to start fresh, something he couldn't allow. He was determined to take matters into his own hands. Heather's decision to break up with him had shattered his sense of control, and he felt betrayed, vowing to make her pay for rejecting him. On that night, he tracked Heather down to her apartment, determined to force his way back into her life by any means necessary. Once at Heather's apartment, Brinkman confronted her. Whether there was a verbal exchange before the physical violence began is unclear, but it quickly escalated into a brutal attack. Heather tried to fight back, but Brinkman's violent rage was overwhelming. In his twisted mind, the only way to make Heather submit to him was through force. He physically assaulted her, using threats of harm to try and intimidate her into submission. But Heather fought for her life, desperate to escape the terrifying grip he had on her. Tragically, her resistance proved futile. The details of the attack were horrifying. Brinkman used his physical strength to overpower Heather, leaving her defenseless. He assaulted her so violently that she suffered severe injuries, and in the end, her life was brutally snuffed out. The attack didn't stop there, though. In his rage, Brinkman went even further, moving on to two more victims. The violence that had been initially directed at Heather spread to two other women who had been involved in his obsessive attempts to regain control over Heather. One of these women was a friend of Heather's, someone who had also been entangled in Brinkman's twisted world of manipulation and emotional abuse. Brinkman's toxic need to dominate and control had extended beyond Heather. These other women had, in some way, become targets of his rage because of their perceived connection to Heather. In a horrifying act of brutality, Brinkman murdered two innocent women, one of whom had tried to support Heather and help her break free from Brinkman's clutches. His violent rage was no longer just about Heather. It was about asserting dominance over anyone who had any influence over her. These murders were not random. They were an extension of his toxic need for control, showing just how far Brinkman was willing to go to manipulate and dominate those around him. The murders shocked the community. The loss of 3 lives, including Heather's, left the town of North Royalton in disbelief. It wasn't long before the discovery of Heather's body would lead police down a path they hadn't expected. Her body was discovered just a few days after her disappearance. Heather's family, already grieving her loss, was left with unanswered questions. Police began piecing together the details of the case, working tirelessly to track down her killer. The investigation into Heather's death initially led to dead ends, but as they dug deeper, evidence began to surface that connected Brinkman to the crime. Brinkman's obsession with Heather and his violent outbursts were well documented. He had a history of emotionally abusive relationships and had been involved in prior altercations. But what truly tied him to the crime were the eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence that began to emerge. Neighbors who had heard strange noises and seen suspicious activity around the time of Heather's death came forward, offering critical pieces of the puzzle. Police were able to trace Brinkman's movements that night, connecting the dots between his previous threats to Heather and the actual events leading up to her murder. As Brinkman's involvement in the murders became clearer, detectives began uncovering the details of his behavior in the days following the killings. Brinkman initially tried to mislead investigators by presenting a calm and controlled demeanor, but his actions during the investigation revealed his guilt. He made several attempts to cover up his crimes, offering conflicting accounts of his whereabouts and actions that night. He was evasive, giving conflicting statements about his relationship with Heather, his whereabouts, and his actions before and after the murder. The evidence against him was mounting. His history of obsessive behavior, the witnesses who had seen him near the scene of the crimes, and the forensic evidence that tied him to the murders made it clear that he was the killer. Despite his attempts to cover his tracks, Brinkman's obsession with Heather and his need for control had ultimately led to his capture. The investigation into the murders of Heather and the 2 other women took a devastating turn as the full scope of Brinkman's violence became known. His obsession with Heather wasn't just a passing fixation. It was a deadly and dangerous obsession that led him to murder anyone who stood in his way. The police's methodical work, combined with the courage of witnesses who came forward, eventually led to Brinkman's arrest. His chilling confession would stun the public, revealing the depth of his rage and obsession. He was not just a man who had lost control in the heat of the moment. He was a man who had methodically planned to use violence to regain the control he so desperately craved. This case raised important questions about the nature of obsessive relationships, toxic love, and the lengths to which some individuals will go to dominate others. It also shone a light on the emotional and psychological toll that such relationships take on victims, and how the desire to break free from an abusive partner can sometimes be met with deadly violence. The investigation didn't just uncover the physical evidence that linked Brinkman to the crime, it revealed the disturbing and tragic patterns of abuse and manipulation that had led to the deaths of Heather Bogle and the 2 other victims. The details of the case and Brinkman's obsessive, violent behavior served as a stark reminder of the dangers of toxic relationships and emotional abuse. What was particularly horrifying was not just the murder itself, but the fact that it was driven by an unhealthy obsession, a desire for control, and an inability to cope with rejection. Brinkman's actions sparked a broader conversation about the darker side of relationships, raising awareness about the escalation of abusive behavior and the deadly consequences of unaddressed emotional manipulation. In the months following the murders, the case became a focal point in discussions about domestic violence, obsessive love, and the devastating effects of controlling relationships. People across the country were horrified to learn how Brinkman's toxic need for control had led to 3 deaths. His pattern of behavior, from emotional abuse and manipulation to physical violence, painted a disturbing portrait of the destructive potential of obsessive love. Many saw Heather's tragic death as an example of how emotional abuse can quickly escalate into physical violence, and how controlling behavior can ultimately lead to tragedy. This case brought to light the real dangers of domestic violence, particularly in its more insidious forms. The media coverage focused on the psychological toll that abusive relationships take on victims, and the need for more resources and support systems for those caught in toxic relationships. Conversations about toxic masculinity, emotional control, and domestic violence gained momentum, with many advocating for stronger laws, better education, and a cultural shift in how we address unhealthy and abusive relationships. Brinkman's arrest marked the beginning of the legal process that would hold him accountable for his horrific crimes. He was charged with 3 counts of murder, one for Heather Bogle and the other 2 women, and faced a lengthy and complicated legal battle. His trial, like the investigation, was marked by the revelation of just how deeply entrenched his obsession and violent tendencies were. The prosecution highlighted his emotional manipulation, control, and obsessive behavior, all of which had driven him to commit the murders. Brinkman's defense, however, tried to downplay his actions, but the overwhelming evidence against him left little room for doubt. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the emotional toll of the case was felt most deeply by Heather's family and friends. Heather had been a vibrant, caring woman who had been looking forward to a brighter future. Her death not only shattered her loved ones, but also exposed the devastating effects of Brinkman's manipulation. The toll on those closest to her was immeasurable. Heather's parents, friends, and co-workers were left with the overwhelming sadness of knowing that a woman with so much potential had been taken from them too soon, not by a random act of violence, but by someone who could not accept the end of their toxic relationship. In the end, George Brinkman was convicted of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. While the legal system had delivered justice for Heather, the emotional scars left by the crime would never fully heal for her family and friends. The case was a painful reminder of how deeply toxic relationships can impact not only the people involved, but the entire community surrounding them. Heather's tragic death, however, would not be in vain. Her story would go on to serve as a powerful catalyst for raising awareness about the dangers of toxic relationships and emotional abuse. The case highlighted the need for stronger support systems for individuals in abusive situations and for better education around the signs of unhealthy relationships. It also sparked a broader conversation about the importance of providing resources for people who are trapped in emotionally abusive dynamics and the need for intervention before violence escalates. The legacy of Heather Bogle is a reminder that controlling and obsessive behavior can have deadly consequences, and that the emotional manipulation of one person can ultimately tear apart the lives of others. Despite the tragedy of her loss, her death forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence and the ways in which such relationships can spiral into violence. Heather's case serves as a call to action, an urgent reminder of the need for vigilance, support, and intervention in the fight against obsessive, controlling relationships. As we reflect on Heather's legacy, it's impossible not to consider how much could have been done to prevent the tragedy. The warning signs were there, but they were ignored. George Brinkman's failure to cope with rejection, his obsessive need for control, and his violent actions all went unchecked until it was too late. Heather's story reminds us that the fight against domestic violence and obsessive relationships is ongoing, and it requires our collective attention and action. Now, we are about to transition to another case that had a significant impact on how the legal system views obsessive relationships and the devastating outcomes they can produce. Next, we will go into the murder of Travis Alexander by Jodi Arias, a case that not only shocked the nation but sparked a conversation about justice, race, and societal tensions. Stay with us as we explore how the tragic death of a young girl in 1913 led to one of the most controversial and significant legal battles in American history. Part 6. The Killing of Travis Alexander by Jodi Arias. In the summer of 2008, a crime shocked the nation and captivated the public's attention for months. Travis Alexander, a successful and charismatic 30-year-old motivational speaker, was brutally murdered in his home in Mesa, Arizona, by his ex-girlfriend, Jodi Arias. The details of the crime were chilling. Travis was stabbed multiple times, shot in the face, and had his throat slashed in a violent, premeditated attack. What began as a relationship full of passion and excitement spiraled into an obsessive and toxic dynamic, culminating in a horrific act of violence. Ready to know more about the crime? Keep watching then. Mesa, Arizona, is known for its suburban calm, quiet streets, family homes, and a close-knit community. On the surface, it seemed like a peaceful place, but behind the doors of Travis Alexander's home, a storm was brewing. Travis was a popular, charming man, well-liked by those around him. He had a successful career, a strong social circle, and a faith that guided his decisions. But despite his outward success, his relationship with Jodi Arias was anything but healthy. Jodi, a woman who had been deeply infatuated with Travis, was unable to accept that their relationship had come to an end. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly turned toxic, with Jodi's obsession growing as she struggled to move on. Jodi's fixation with Travis turned into a dangerous obsession, and by June 4, 2008, it would result in the shocking murder of a man who once seemed to have it all. The murder, as brutal as it was calculated, would reveal a side to Jodi that no one could have predicted. So, how did this once passionate relationship turn into such a tragedy? How could a woman driven by love and jealousy turn into a killer? What motivated Jodi to commit such an unforgivable act, despite the many chances she had to walk away? Now, let's take a closer look at the backstory. How their relationship evolved from innocent affection to an obsession that would spiral into a deadly crime. We'll uncover the events leading up to the fateful night of June 4, 2008. Let's dive deeper into the story and check out what really happened between Jodi Arias and Travis Alexander. Jodi Arias's background is one marked by emotional turmoil, which would ultimately shape her future actions. Born on July 9, 1980, in Salinas, California, Jodi's early life was far from simple. Raised in a middle-class family, she had a difficult relationship with her parents. Jodi's father was reportedly distant and emotionally unavailable, while her mother, though more involved, was often described as overbearing and controlling. Jodi's upbringing in a tense and volatile home environment fostered feelings of insecurity and emotional neglect, contributing to her later behavior in relationships. From a young age, Jodi seemed to crave attention and affection, seeking validation from others, particularly men. Her early relationships were often unhealthy, marked by her emotional dependency on partners. She dated a series of men throughout her teenage years and into her 20s, with many of these relationships showing signs of emotional imbalance, manipulation, and infatuation. Jodi's attachment to her boyfriends seemed to escalate quickly, often turning obsessive. She became overly involved in their lives, expecting them to fill the emotional void she felt inside. When these relationships ended, Jodi would spiral into deep depression, unable to cope with rejection or loss. This pattern of intense emotional dependency would later manifest in her relationship with Travis Alexander. Jodi's infatuation with Travis began in 2007, when they met at a convention for a company they both worked for. Travis had a thriving career as a motivational speaker and entrepreneur, and Jodi was drawn to his charismatic personality. Travis was not immediately interested in a relationship with Jodi, but over time, they developed a flirtatious, sexual relationship. Jodi, however, became deeply emotionally attached to Travis much faster than he did to her. This initial connection seemed like the start of something promising, but as their physical relationship progressed, Jodi's feelings for Travis deepened into an obsessive infatuation. She began to imagine a future together, despite the fact that Travis was not as emotionally invested. On the other hand, for Travis Alexander's background, it was rooted in faith, hard work, and success. Born on July 28, 1977, in Riverside, California, Travis grew up in a large family. He was the fourth of 7 children and was raised in a religious Mormon household. His upbringing in the Mormon church had a profound influence on his character, instilling in him strong values of morality, discipline, and respect for others. Travis was an outgoing, ambitious, and charismatic man, known for his positive attitude, infectious personality, and drive to succeed. He had a way of making people feel special, which made him well-liked in both personal and professional circles. Travis had dreams of making it big and helping others, and his career as a motivational speaker and entrepreneur was thriving. While Travis was successful and well-liked, his personal life was more complicated. Travis had struggled with his own romantic relationships, He had been in a few serious relationships, some of which had ended due to issues of trust, intimacy, and commitment. While he was still active in the Mormon faith, his dating life reflected a struggle to reconcile his faith with his personal desires, especially when it came to dating outside the boundaries of the church's teachings. Despite his charm and outward success, Travis was a man with deep emotional wounds, particularly stemming from his past relationships and his complicated feelings about sex, intimacy, and commitment. When Jody entered his life, Travis was in a stage of personal growth and transition. Though they initially had a passionate sexual connection, Travis was hesitant to commit to Jody on a deeper level. His feelings for her were complicated by his awareness of the emotional baggage she brought with her. Travis, while enjoying the physical aspect of their relationship, struggled with the emotional intensity Jody was bringing to it. He had ended previous relationships when he felt overwhelmed, and he sensed that Jody was someone who could become too dependent on him emotionally. Jody's obsessive behavior began to emerge more clearly as the relationship developed. Initially, she was content to enjoy their fling, but as time went on, she became fixated on Travis. She began to believe they were meant to be together, convincing herself that they had a special connection. She began showering him with affection, sending him loving texts, and talking about their potential future together. For Travis, however, the relationship was never meant to be permanent. He wasn't ready to settle down with Jody, and the dynamic soon became one of emotional imbalance. Travis was clear about his need to move on from their physical relationship, but Jody, driven by her growing infatuation, couldn't let go. The emotional toll of this imbalance soon became evident. While Travis tried to maintain boundaries, Jody's need for him intensified. She couldn't accept the idea that Travis wanted to end their sexual relationship, and her attachment turned into a controlling obsession. Despite Travis trying to distance himself, Jody continued to reach out to him, creating an emotional push-pull dynamic that left Travis feeling increasingly trapped. Jody's behavior was becoming more erratic. She would often show up uninvited at his house, send him texts, and bombard him with attention. As time passed, Travis became more frustrated with Jody's inability to let go. He began dating other women, further escalating Jody's jealousy and obsession. At some point, Travis attempted to break things off entirely, but Jody wasn't willing to let go. She had convinced herself that they were meant to be together, despite his repeated efforts to end the relationship. Jody became increasingly possessive, and any attempt by Travis to move on was met with resistance. This obsession led to emotional manipulation, as Jody tried to guilt Travis into continuing their relationship. Travis, meanwhile, was caught in a cycle of trying to be compassionate yet firm, while Jody's emotional instability became harder to manage. She would accuse him of not truly caring for her, and this would often lead to confrontations, where Jody's anger flared. Yet, each time, she would apologize and convince Travis that she had changed. By the spring of 2008, Travis had firmly ended things with Jody and had begun dating someone else. This was the final blow for Jody, whose obsession with Travis had reached its peak. She couldn't handle the rejection. Jody's jealousy and anger took over, and she became determined to have Travis back at any cost. Her behavior turned from emotional manipulation to something darker. She began following him, watching his interactions with other women, and continuing to attempt contact despite his clear desire to move on. Jody's obsessive attachment led her to fantasize about a future with Travis, even though he had made it clear that he didn't see her as part of his future. For Jody, the rejection was too much to bear, and she began to plot her next steps. Despite the passionate connection they once shared, their relationship had spiraled into an unhealthy and toxic one. It was no longer just about love. It was about control, jealousy, and obsession. Travis's efforts to move on were met with resistance, and Jody's fixation on him became a dangerous and uncontrollable force. This toxic dynamic would set the stage for the brutal crime that would unfold on after on. Now, we are about to go deeper into the fateful events that led to Travis Alexander's tragic death, and how Jody's obsessive love and jealousy culminated in one of the most horrific murders of the decade. Let's take a closer look at how the night of June 4th, 2008, would change everything for Travis, Jody, and those left behind. On that day, Jodi Arias drove to Travis Alexander's home in Mesa, Arizona, under the guise of wanting to spend time with him, despite their tumultuous breakup. At this point, Travis had been trying to move on from their on-again, off-again relationship, which had become toxic and emotionally draining. Jodi, however, was determined to rekindle what she had once convinced herself was a love worth fighting for. After a string of confrontations, manipulations, and desperate attempts to hold on to Travis, Jodi's obsession with him had reached its peak. Travis, despite his attempts to keep his distance, had allowed Jodi into his home once more, likely out of a mix of compassion and a sense of guilt. The night they spent together would turn out to be their last. What seemed like a normal reunion quickly escalated into a horrific crime. The details surrounding Travis's murder are chilling and brutal, and the crime scene revealed the extent of Jodi's rage and premeditation. The violent attack unfolded quickly. Jodi, seemingly unable to let go of her toxic attachment to Travis, attacked him in his own home. She stabbed him multiple times, each blow inflicted with extreme force. The attack was not a crime of passion. It was calculated and brutal, as though Jodi was trying to exact a final, violent form of control over a man who had already rejected her. After stabbing Travis multiple times, Jodi's rage seemed to reach its climax. She shot him in the face, further ensuring his death. The final act of violence came when Jodi slashed Travis's throat in a manner so brutal that it appeared to be an execution. The scene was horrifically violent, and the nature of the crime suggested that this was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was calculated and driven by a deep-seated obsession. The extreme violence of the murder stood in stark contrast to the moments of tenderness they once shared. Jodi had gone from being a woman obsessed with love to a woman driven by rage, unable to control her emotions or let go of her toxic attachment to Travis. For several days, Travis's friends had been unable to get in touch with him, which was unusual for someone so active and social. Concern grew as the days passed, and eventually, a close friend, worried about Travis's well-being, went to his home to check on him. When they entered his house, they were met with a scene so gruesome that it seemed almost unreal. Travis's body was found in a pool of blood, his injuries making it clear that he had died in a violent struggle. The police were immediately called, and the investigation began in earnest. As authorities started to examine the crime scene, it quickly became clear that the murder was not a random act. The extreme violence, combined with the emotional context of the crime, suggested that this was a personal attack. The fact that Travis had been stabbed multiple times, shot, and had his throat slashed made it evident that whoever had committed this murder had deep emotional ties to the victim, possibly feelings of anger, betrayal, or jealousy. As the investigation progressed, the police began to focus on Jodi Arias, who was known to have been one of the last people to see Travis alive. At first, Jodi's behavior seemed to follow the script of someone grieving. She expressed sorrow over Travis's death and seemed cooperative with the police investigation. However, it didn't take long for her story to raise suspicion. Jodi initially denied being involved in the murder, but inconsistencies in her statements soon became apparent. She claimed that she had been at Travis's house the day of the murder but had left before anything had happened. She also claimed that she had not seen Travis since that day, yet evidence quickly surfaced that contradicted her claims. Jodi's conflicting statements about her whereabouts on the day of the murder immediately raised questions. She initially told police that she had not been at Travis's house at all that day, yet forensic evidence, including her fingerprints, would later place her at the scene. Furthermore, as the investigation deepened, it was discovered that Jodi had been caught on a series of photographs taken on Travis's camera, one of which showed her standing over his lifeless body. In addition to the photographs, phone records revealed that Jodi had been in constant communication with Travis up until the time of the murder, further suggesting that she was lying about her actions that day. Despite the mounting evidence, Jodi's demeanor remained puzzlingly detached. She continued to deny any involvement in the murder, offering a string of ever-changing alibis, some of which seemed increasingly bizarre. At one point, she claimed that 2 intruders had broken into Travis's home and killed him, But this story was quickly debunked by evidence. Her behavior became more erratic, and her contradictory statements about the murder raised suspicion. It became clear that Jodi had something to hide, and the investigation soon honed in on her as the prime suspect. The media frenzy that followed Travis's murder quickly turned Jodi Arias into a household name. As more details of the crime emerged, the public's interest in the case only grew. Jodi's trial became a spectacle, with media outlets covering every detail, from her dramatic testimony to the inconsistencies in her stories. The details of Travis's brutal death, combined with Jodi's contradictory statements and bizarre behavior, captivated the public. Many were shocked at how someone who seemed so capable of love and charm could turn into a cold-blooded murderer, and the psychological aspects of the case, Jodi's obsession, jealousy, and emotional manipulation, became central to the trial. As the case unfolded, Jodi's obsession with Travis and her inability to accept his rejection became the central theme. It became clear that Jodi's deep emotional attachment to Travis had driven her to extremes, first emotional manipulation and, ultimately, to murder. The question that plagued many was whether she was a woman driven to violence by her obsession, or whether she had coldly and intentionally planned to kill Travis from the start. Her trial would continue to captivate the public for months, with each new revelation about the crime deepening the intrigue surrounding the case. Now, with the investigation underway and the details of the murder becoming increasingly clear, the focus of the trial turned to the shocking and disturbing psychology behind Jodi Arias's actions. What drove a woman to go from infatuation to violence? How could someone so seemingly normal descend into such a horrific crime? As the media continued to follow every twist and turn of the case, the public remained glued to the outcome, eager for answers to questions that seemed to grow darker and more complex with each passing day. Following Jodi Arias's arrest, the legal proceedings moved quickly, and the case became a media sensation. Jodi was indicted for the murder of Travis Alexander, facing charges of first-degree murder, including the heinous nature of the crime, stabbing Travis multiple times, shooting him, and slashing his throat. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves throughout the public, but it was the trial that truly captivated audiences across the nation. The trial was heavily publicized, drawing in millions of viewers who were riveted by the testimony, the emotional outbursts, and the back and forth between the prosecution and defense. The defense strategy was one that aimed to humanize Jodi, portraying her as a victim of emotional abuse at the hands of Travis. Jodi's attorneys argued that her actions were a result of the trauma she had suffered during her relationship with Travis, claiming she had been manipulated, controlled, and physically abused. They painted Jodi as a woman who had been driven to an extreme act of violence due to her inability to cope with Travis's rejection, presenting her as a victim of what they called battered woman syndrome. This defense was intended to evoke sympathy and to reduce the severity of the charges against her. However, the prosecution's argument was far more direct and damning. They asserted that Jodi's actions were motivated by jealousy and rage after Travis ended their relationship. They argued that she premeditated the murder and that her obsessive behavior had finally exploded into violent action. They pointed to the brutal nature of the crime as evidence of her malice and premeditation, emphasizing the fact that Jodi had not acted in self-defense, as she later claimed, but instead had planned the murder with chilling detail. The photos of Travis's murder, the phone records, and the DNA evidence all painted a picture of a woman who had planned and executed a brutal crime in a fit of jealousy and rage. Her behavior in court, alternating between tears, defiance, and manipulation, only added to the public's fascination with the case. The trial dragged on for months, with each new piece of evidence making the case more complex and more emotionally charged. Travis's family and friends were forced to relive his brutal death as they testified in court and were presented with graphic images of the crime scene. The emotional toll on Travis's loved ones was profound, as they were repeatedly confronted with the most traumatic moments of their lives. Travis's parents, siblings, and friends were not just grieving their loss. They were participating in a public battle to ensure that Jodi's actions were recognized for what they were: a cold-blooded, premeditated murder. The jury deliberated for weeks, and when the verdict was finally reached, Jodi Arias was convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction was a significant moment in the case, But it wasn't the end. The trial continued with the sentencing phase, where the jury had to decide whether Jody would receive the death penalty or life in prison. After a while, Jody was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, as the jury could not come to a unanimous decision on the death penalty. The sentencing marked the end of the legal battle, but for those involved, it was just another chapter in a long, painful journey. The trial and the events surrounding it sparked a massive public reaction. Jodi Arias became a polarizing figure, with many viewing her as a woman driven to violence by the emotional abuse she had suffered, while others saw her as a manipulative, cold-blooded murderer. The media played a massive role in shaping public perception, feeding the public's obsession with the case by broadcasting every moment of the trial. Jodi's dramatic behavior in the courtroom, her emotional outbursts, her seemingly rehearsed testimony, and her contradictions only fueled the public's fascination with her. Many people were captivated by the spectacle of the trial, as Jodi became one of the most talked about figures in America. The case also reignited debates on the nature of obsession, love, and violence in relationships. Was Jodi a victim of abuse who lashed out in an act of desperation, or was she a manipulative woman who used Travis's affection to control and destroy him when he rejected her? Public opinion about the case was deeply divided. Some believed Jodi's version of events, feeling sympathy for her emotional pain and seeing her as a victim of an abusive relationship. Others saw her as calculating, using the defense of abuse as a cover for her violent actions. As the trial played out in the media, the public became obsessed with Jodi's every move. She was scrutinized for the way she spoke, the way she dressed, and her demeanor in the courtroom. The national conversation centered on the nature of Jodi's actions and what they revealed about human behavior. Was her obsession with Travis simply a tragic side effect of a broken heart? Or was it the result of a deeper, more dangerous psychological condition? Amid the sensational media coverage and the debates about Jodi's motivations, one thing remained undeniable. Travis Alexander's life had been tragically cut short by the woman he once loved. Travis's family and friends were left grappling with the loss of a man who had so much potential. Travis had been a man who, despite his flaws, had a positive impact on many people's lives. He was known for his charisma, his kindness, and his drive to succeed. He was a man who had been well on his way to making a meaningful difference in the world before his life was brutally taken from him. Travis's legacy has lived on, not just through the grief of his family and friends, but through the lessons his story has taught about love, obsession, and the red flags of toxic relationships. His death and the subsequent trial sparked important conversations about emotional abuse and unhealthy relationships. In the years since his death, his family has worked tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence, helping to shed light on the warning signs of toxic relationships that may seem harmless at first but can escalate into something deadly. The case serves as a reminder of how deeply emotional wounds can affect behavior and how unchecked obsession can spiral into violence. In the end, Travis's death and Jodi's conviction serve as tragic bookends to a story of love gone wrong, a reminder that the line between passion and obsession can be dangerously thin, and once crossed, it can result in devastating outcomes for everyone involved. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. We've just covered 6 true crime stories, each with its own twists and shocking details. So, which part of the story did you find most compelling? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.